Welcome back to Red Pill Examined, where I look at and debunk red pill talking points and expose red pill content creators as hypocrites, liars, and scammers. And in this video, we'll be breaking down how Donovan Sharpe committed identity fraud against his own father. Now, the reason why this is pertinent to the Manosphere is because what's oftentimes repeated within red pill circles is that a woman's past matters, as it will undoubtedly determine her future, which in many ways is correct. And so with that in mind, it's only fair to give many of these red pill content creators the same just due and look at their past to determine whether they should or shouldn't be taken seriously. And in Donovan Sharpe's case, that past includes a third-degree felony charge with some very interesting details. Now, the first thing to understand when it comes to Donovan Sharpe is that the name Donovan Sharpe is fake, and in my personal opinion, was only used up until recently in an effort to conceal his criminal past, which in many ways discredits a lot of the points he makes today. However, in light of recent events, Donovan Sharpe finally told his audience his real name, so let's hear what that is.
If the reason I say this is because myself, listen, my legal name is Edwin Hopkins, right? Edwin Alexander Hopkins Jr. It's all over the internet now, for better or worse. The reason I say this is because me personally.
So after doing a bit of research, I was able to come across one of Donovan Sharpe's felony charges, that being identity fraud, which took place while he lived in the state of Florida. However, what was most disturbing about that case were the details of how Donovan Sharpe committed said felony, as well as the identity of the victim. What I also want to make sure to point out before continuing is that this case is a matter of public records, and it is therefore lawful to make the details of this case public. So with that being said, let's now look at the case in question. Now, the first document on the screen is what's called the felony information, which is the formal charging document that describes the criminal charges against a person and the factual basis for those charges. And as we see, Donovan Sharpe at the time was 26 years of age, and the official charge was fraudulent use of personal identification information, which is a third-degree felony. The document goes on to state that Edwin Hopkins Jr. in the county of Pinellas and the state of Florida, on the 8th day of September 2003, did willfully and without authorization fraudulently use or possess with intent to use personal identification information concerning an individual, Edwin Hopkins Sr., without first obtaining Edwin Hopkins Sr.'s consent, contrary to Chapter 817.568 Florida statutes and against the peace and dignity of the state of Florida. So now let's move on to the next document, that being the witness affidavit, which is a sworn written statement from a witness in the case. And as a quick aside, the witness in this case, also called an affiant, was a duly sworn law enforcement investigator with the St. Petersburg Police Department. So with that out of the way, here is what he had to say. Your affiant learned from the Plant City Police Department that on September 8, 2003, Edwin Hopkins Jr. had used his father's social security number to rent an apartment in Pinellas County, Florida. Your affiant went to the apartment complex and obtained a copy of Edwin Hopkins Jr.'s rental application, which includes Edwin Hopkins Jr.'s signature and Edwin Hopkins Sr.'s social security number. Your affiant learned that Edwin Hopkins Jr. had defaulted on his rental payments in the amount of $8,000.08. On June 16, 2004, your affiant spoke with Edwin Hopkins Sr., who advised that the outstanding balance showed up on his credit report. Edwin Hopkins Sr. does wish to prosecute his son for the crime of identity theft. Your affiant learned that Edwin Hopkins Jr. obtained a Florida identification card listing the above-mentioned apartment as his current address. Your affiant has been unable to locate Edwin Hopkins Jr. The document goes on to state, wherefore your affiant respectfully requests this honorable court to issue a capias for the arrest of Edwin Hopkins Jr. for the offense of fraudulent use of personal identification information so that he may be made to answer to this charge. Now, for those of you guys who may be unaware, a capias is a warrant. So what the police was requesting from the court was a warrant for the arrest of Edwin Hopkins Jr., also known as Donovan Sharpe. And as we see, the judge at the time granted their request and signed a document which stated, "I have reviewed this affidavit and do find there is probable cause to hold and bind over for trial the defendant named in this affidavit. Clerk of this court is hereby directed to issue capias for arrest of defendant Edwin Hopkins Jr. Defendant is to be admitted to bail in the sum of $10,000. Now, shortly thereafter, the arrest warrant was issued, which in my opinion led to Donovan Sharpe fleeing the state of Florida. However, 16 years later, on April 2nd, 2021, all charges were dismissed because, as the document states, the warrant was outstanding and there had been no procedural activity in this case for 16 years. The defendant, that being Edwin Hopkins Jr., also known as Donovan Sharpe, had also paid all outstanding financial obligations on March 26, 2021. And so this case was officially closed as of last year. Now, in light of all of this information, there are some key takeaways I'd like to discuss. For one, Donovan Sharpe at the time of this crime was married. And the reason why this is relevant is because when discussing the divorce rate, red pill content creators oftentimes look at the fact that women initiate 80% of divorces and thus deduce that women are mostly to blame for the lack of successful marriages today. However, what Donovan Sharpe has demonstrated is what's oftentimes left out of these conversations, and it's that the husbands in many of these instances are just as much at fault for the dissolution of the marriage as the wives. And in Donovan Sharpe's case, his criminal and reckless behavior could have landed his then wife in jail. Another point is that Donovan Sharpe knows the impact that something like this would have on his image and potential future earnings, which is why when he now discusses his criminal past, he'll only talk about his quote-unquote violent felonies and omit the fact that at one point in his life while married, he chose to commit identity fraud against his very own father to the tune of $8,000. And so the purpose of this video was to show that when the past of many of these red pill content creators is held up to the light, they come out as no better than the very women they criticize. And in Donovan Sharpe's case, even worse. Now, many of his followers will say that his past is his past and that it doesn't define the man he is today. But is that truly the case? Because the way in which he used false information back in 2003 so that he could sign a leasing agreement is very similar to the way in which he's used false information about his relationship, which he's been caught lying about numerous times, to sell his dating and relationship courses. So has he truly changed? Well, to that, I say no. And if his past is any indication of the future, then rest assured that he has no plans on stopping anytime soon.
And by the way, my dad is so funny. My dad, and you've heard conversations between me and my dad, Dev. He'll be like, yeah, you have some very interesting takes on issues. My dad, the spineless f***ing beta male he is, does not have the heart to step to his own son and say, hey, look, son, I disagree with you. So rather than him saying, I disagree, well, you talk about some interesting things on the air. Maybe you should tune it back a little bit. My dad, the spineless f***ing beta male he is, Trav Hawkins wants to know, how would I deal with a beta dad? I don't know, man. I don't really talk to my dad that much. I don't have a very good relationship with him. We're cordial. So, it is what it is.